On a cold morning in 1847, before the sun had fully risen over the endless plains of America, a young mother stood beside a wooden wagon and watched her entire future disappear into the horizon. Her name was Elizabeth Carter, and in front of her was a road that thousands of Americans had called a path to hope, but many others had called a road of suffering. The wagon wheels creaked. The oxen pulled slowly against the heavy weight of everything the family owned. Behind them was the only home they had ever known. Ahead of them was more than 2,000 miles of wilderness, mountains, rivers, deserts, disease, hunger, and uncertainty. Elizabeth held her 8-year-old son's hand tightly. "Will we really find a better life out there?" the boy asked. She looked toward the endless trail stretching west. For a moment, she had no answer, because the truth was something every pioneer knew but rarely admitted. The Oregon Trail was not a simple journey to a new home. It was a fight against nature itself. It was a test of courage, faith, and survival. And many people who started the journey would never see the place they dreamed of reaching. Between the 1830s and 1860s, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children crossed the American frontier on trails leading westward. They left behind farms, businesses, families, and familiar towns because they believed something better waited beyond the Rocky Mountains. Some wanted fertile land. Some wanted gold. Some wanted religious freedom. Some simply wanted a second chance. But almost none of them truly understood what awaited them. The Oregon Trail was not like the adventures shown in romantic paintings. There were no comfortable roads, no hotels, no grocery stores, no doctors waiting nearby. Every mile had to be earned. Every meal had to be protected. Every sunrise brought a new danger. For families like the Carters, the journey began months before they ever reached the trail. Preparing for the Oregon Trail required careful planning. A family could not simply pack a few bags and leave. They had to decide what was important enough to carry and what they had to abandon forever. A typical wagon, called a prairie schooner, was only about 12 feet long and 4 feet wide. It looked large from the outside, but inside it was painfully small. Most families carried flour, beans, bacon, coffee, sugar, clothing, tools, weapons, blankets, medicine, and spare wagon parts. But weight was their greatest enemy. A wagon that was too heavy could break down miles away from civilization. Many pioneers discovered this painful truth after starting their journey. They carried furniture, books, family treasures, and items that reminded them of home. But as the miles passed and the animals became exhausted, many travelers threw those possessions onto the side of the trail. Today, historians still find old wagon remains and broken household items along the routes. Pieces of plates, iron tools, children's toys, wedding gifts, objects that once had deep meaning but became too heavy to carry. The trail became a graveyard of memories. Elizabeth remembered the day her family prepared to leave Missouri. Her husband, Thomas, had spent months repairing their wagon. He was not a wealthy man. He was a farmer who had struggled with unpredictable weather and difficult economic conditions. Like many Americans during that time, he heard stories about Oregon's rich soil and endless opportunities. Travelers returning from the West spoke about land where a family could grow crops and build a new future. The stories sounded almost magical. But few people talked about the suffering required to get there. The family sold almost everything they owned: the house where their children were born, the furniture Elizabeth's mother had given her, the tools Thomas had inherited from his father. Everything was exchanged for supplies and hope. On the morning they left, Neighbors gathered to say goodbye. Some wished them luck. Others quietly wondered if they would ever return, because everyone knew the risks. The Oregon Trail was not a journey for the weak. The first challenge was simply surviving the beginning. Thousands of people traveled together in wagon trains because the wilderness was too dangerous for a single family. A wagon train could include 20 wagons or more than 100. Travelers relied on each other. A farmer might repair another person's wagon. A hunter might share meat. A stranger might become the person who saved your life. But traveling in a group also created problems. Every family had different opinions, different fears, different personalities. The trail forced people to live with strangers for months under extreme pressure. Arguments were common. Some wanted to travel faster. Others wanted to stop and rest. Some believed they should take one route. Others believed another route was safer. Small disagreements sometimes became serious conflicts. Yet cooperation was often the difference between life and death. The daily routine of Oregon Trail life was exhausting. Most travelers woke before sunrise. There was no sleeping late. The animals needed attention. Breakfast had to be prepared. The camp had to be packed. A family might spend 1 or 2 hours every morning simply preparing to move. Then the long journey began. The wagons usually traveled between 10 and 15 miles per day. That may sound easy today, but imagine doing it over rough ground while walking beside a wagon for months. The trail was not smooth. There were deep holes, sharp rocks, mud, sand, and steep hills. Many pioneers actually walked most of the way because the wagons were too crowded. Children walked, women walked, older people walked. The trail demanded constant movement. Elizabeth's son, Samuel, hated the first weeks. His feet hurt. The dust covered his face. The endless grasslands seemed to never end. He missed his old home. He missed playing near the river. He missed knowing where tomorrow would begin. One evening, after a difficult day crossing the plains, Samuel sat beside the campfire and watched thousands of stars above him. "I don't think this road ever ends," he whispered. His father smiled sadly. "Most important roads feel that way when you are still traveling them." But even Thomas did not know how difficult the coming months would become, because ahead of them waited some of the greatest dangers on the Oregon Trail. The rivers, the mountains, the diseases, the storms, and the terrible decisions that could determine whether a family survived or vanished forever. The next morning, the wagon wheels began turning again, westward, always westward, toward a dream that would demand a price no one could fully understand. And for the Carter family, the real journey was only beginning. The Oregon Trail had a way of changing people. At the beginning of the journey, many pioneers were filled with excitement. They imagined beautiful valleys, fresh farmland, new opportunities. They imagined the moment when they would finally stand on their own piece of land in the West and say, "We made it." But after weeks of walking beside a wagon, after sleeping on hard ground, after breathing dust from thousands of wagon wheels, the dream began to feel much farther away. The trail slowly removed every illusion. It showed people what they were truly made of. For Thomas Carter and his family, the Great Plains were the first great challenge, a place that looked peaceful from a distance, a place that could become dangerous without warning. The prairie seemed endless. Every morning brought the same view, grass stretching toward the horizon, a huge sky above, a narrow trail disappearing into the distance. At first, Samuel Carter loved the landscape. He had never seen anything like it. There were no forests blocking the view. No crowded towns, no fences dividing the land. The world felt enormous. But after many days, even beauty could become exhausting. The same horizon appeared again and again. The same wind blew through the grass. The same wagon wheels followed the same path. The journey became a battle against time. Every family wanted to keep moving, because everyone understood one terrible truth. They had to cross the mountains before winter. The Oregon Trail followed a strict rhythm. Wake up, pack, travel, stop, cook, sleep, repeat. There was no escaping the routine. A person who became careless could create danger for everyone. A broken wheel could stop an entire wagon train. A sick animal could slow the journey. A missing supply could become a serious problem. Every item had value. Every person had responsibility. Food was one of the biggest concerns. Before leaving, pioneers carefully calculated their supplies. They needed enough food to survive months away from civilization. Common supplies included flour, bacon, beans, rice, sugar, coffee, salt, and dried fruits. But calculations were not always correct. Weather could delay travelers, animals could die, food could spoil. Families sometimes discovered that they had packed too little. Others packed too much and had to abandon supplies because their animals could not pull the weight. The trail forced impossible choices. One afternoon, Elizabeth Carter opened their food container and counted the remaining flour. Her face became serious. Thomas noticed. "What is it?" She looked at him quietly. "We are using more than we planned." Thomas walked closer. "How much?" "Enough that we need to be careful." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They were hundreds of miles from home. There were no nearby stores, no easy way to buy more. A mistake made months earlier could now threaten their survival. Thomas nodded. "We will hunt more." But hunting was not always successful. The travelers had heard stories about enormous herds of buffalo covering the plains, and those stories were true. In some places, buffalo appeared in numbers that seemed impossible. Thousands moved across the land. The sight amazed pioneers. But by the 1840s, many wagon travelers discovered that hunting was not as simple as they imagined. Buffalo were often far from the trail. They were difficult to approach, and chasing them wasted valuable time. Water was another constant concern. The prairie was beautiful, but it could be cruel. A wagon train could not simply travel wherever it wanted. They had to follow routes where water was available. Rivers and streams became important stopping points. But water crossings created some of the most dangerous moments on the trail. A calm river could become deadly. A strong current could pull away animals, supplies, and even people. Many pioneers lost important possessions while crossing rivers. Some lost everything. One evening, the wagon train reached a small river crossing. The water looked harmless, but the travelers knew appearances could be deceiving. The leaders of the group spent hours examining the river. They looked at the depth. They watched the current. They searched for the safest place to cross. Every family waited. Nobody wanted to make the wrong decision. Finally, the wagons began moving forward, slowly, carefully. The oxen stepped into the cold water. The wooden wheels entered the river. The wagon shook. Elizabeth held her children tightly. Samuel watched as the water climbed higher around the wheels. For a moment, the wagon tilted. His heart stopped. Then the oxen pulled harder. The wagon moved forward. They reached the other side. But another family was not so lucky. A wagon behind them slipped. Several supplies fell into the water. Food disappeared. Clothing disappeared. A family's possessions were carried away within seconds. The trail had taken another piece of their old life. Danger did not only come from nature. The pioneers were entering lands where Native American nations had lived for thousands of years. The Great Plains were not empty wilderness. They were homes. They were hunting grounds. They were sacred places. Many native peoples encountered wagon travelers passing through their lands. These meetings were complicated. Some interactions were peaceful. Native people traded food, information, and assistance. They helped travelers understand unfamiliar landscapes. They showed them where water could be found. They traded horses and supplies. But other encounters were tense. The arrival of thousands of settlers brought enormous changes. The movement of wagon trains damaged hunting areas and changed traditional ways of life. Conflicts occurred in some areas. The Oregon Trail was not just a story of American expansion. It was also a story of cultures meeting, clashing, and transforming forever. As the weeks passed, the Carter family began noticing changes. Samuel, once a child who complained about tired feet, became stronger. He learned how to care for animals. He learned how to repair small problems. He learned that survival required patience. Mary stopped asking when they would arrive. She simply accepted the road. Elizabeth became skilled at making meals from limited ingredients. She learned how to stretch supplies, how to preserve food, how to keep her children calm when adults were afraid. The trail changed them. But the greatest danger of the Oregon Trail was something invisible, something no weapon could fight: disease. In the crowded camps of wagon trains, sickness could spread quickly. People from different places traveled together. Many carried illnesses without knowing it. Poor sanitation made conditions worse. There were no modern hospitals, no antibiotics, no advanced medical care. A simple infection could become deadly. A fever could destroy an entire family's hopes. One night, the Carter camp became unusually quiet. A young boy from another wagon had become sick. At first, everyone thought he would recover. Children became sick all the time, but by morning, his condition had worsened. The camp gathered quietly. People who had only known each other for a few weeks stood together. They prayed. They offered help. They shared medicine. But sometimes, the trail demanded a terrible price. The boy's family learned a truth many pioneers would face. The Oregon Trail was not only a journey across land. It was a journey through loss. That night, Samuel asked his mother, "Why do people leave home if this is what happens?" Elizabeth looked at the campfires glowing across the prairie. She thought about the question, because it was the question everyone secretly carried. Why risk everything? Why suffer? Why continue? Finally, she answered, "Because sometimes people believe the future is worth the danger." Samuel looked at the dark trail ahead. He did not know if he understood. But he remembered her words. The wagon train continued west. The plains slowly changed. The grasslands began to rise. The air became different. In the distance, something appeared on the horizon. Something that every pioneer both admired and feared: the Rocky Mountains, the Great Wall standing between them and Oregon. The hardest part of the journey was approaching, and many travelers who survived the plains would discover that the mountains were where the Oregon Trail truly tested the human spirit. The first time Samuel Carter saw the Rocky Mountains, he thought they looked like the edge of the world. For weeks, the Carter family had traveled across endless plains. They had followed rivers. They crossed dusty trails. They watched the same horizon day after day. But now, Far ahead of them, dark shapes rose into the sky. At first, they looked like clouds. Then they became clearer. Mountains, huge mountains, covered with snow, silent, powerful, impossible to ignore. The entire wagon train slowed as people stared toward the west. For some travelers, the sight brought excitement. They believed the mountains meant they were getting closer to Oregon. For others, it brought fear. Because everyone knew the truth. The plains had tested their patience, but the mountains would test their survival. The Rocky Mountains were not a single obstacle. They were a massive wilderness filled with steep trails, unpredictable weather, dangerous passes, and difficult decisions. The pioneers did not have modern roads. They did not have engines powerful enough to climb easily. They had wooden wagons, oxen, horses, and their own strength. Every mountain mile required enormous effort. The trail became narrower. The ground became rougher. The animals became more exhausted. The wagons that had survived thousands of miles now faced their greatest challenge. Before reaching the mountains, wagon trains often stopped to repair everything they could. This was not optional. A broken wagon wheel in the middle of the mountains could mean disaster. Thomas Carter spent 2 days examining their wagon. He checked the wooden frame. He tightened the iron pieces. He repaired small cracks. His hands were covered with dirt and cuts. But he knew every repair mattered. A wagon was not just transportation. It was a family's lifeline. It carried food, tools, blankets, medicine, everything needed to survive. The climb began slowly. The oxen struggled against the increasing weight. The animals had already traveled hundreds of miles. They were thinner, weaker. Their bodies showed the cost of the journey. Pioneers often faced heartbreaking decisions in the mountains. Sometimes animals became too exhausted to continue. Sometimes families had to abandon wagons. Sometimes they had to leave behind items they had carried since the beginning. The trail became a place where people learned the difference between what they wanted and what they truly needed. One afternoon, the Carter family passed a wagon sitting beside the trail. A family stood nearby. Their wagon was filled with furniture, a wooden table, a large chair, several boxes, items from their old home. The husband stared at the wagon with frustration. "We cannot pull it anymore," he said. His wife looked at the furniture. "But this belonged to my parents." The man looked away. He understood. Those objects were not just objects. They were memories. They were proof that the life they left behind had been real. But the mountains did not care about memories. The family eventually removed the furniture and left it beside the road. The wagon became lighter. The journey continued. But a piece of their old life remained behind. The higher the wagon train climbed, the colder the weather became. Many pioneers were surprised by how quickly conditions changed. The same people who had suffered under the burning prairie sun now faced freezing temperatures. Snow could arrive unexpectedly. Storms could trap travelers. A clear morning could become dangerous within hours. The mountains had their own rules. Nature decided when people moved, not the other way around. One of the greatest fears among Oregon trail travelers was arriving too late. Timing was everything. A wagon train leaving too early risked extreme weather in the plains. A wagon train leaving too late risked becoming trapped in the mountains during winter. The pioneers were constantly racing against the calendar. Every delay created anxiety. Every lost day mattered. One evening, the leaders of the wagon train gathered around a fire. Thomas listened carefully. Some travelers wanted to continue quickly. Others believed they needed more rest. The debate became heated. Everyone understood the danger. If they moved too slowly, winter could trap them. If they moved too quickly, exhausted animals and people could collapse. Finally, the group decided they would continue at first light. No one celebrated. There was no excitement, only determination. As the wagon train climbed higher, the trail became more dangerous. Wagons had to move carefully along mountain paths. One mistake could send a wagon sliding down a steep slope. Animals sometimes slipped, wheels sometimes broke. People worked together to prevent disasters. Men pushed, women unloaded supplies, children carried small items. Everyone became part of the effort. The idea of individual survival disappeared. The mountain demanded cooperation. Samuel learned more during those weeks than he had in his entire life before the journey. Before the Oregon Trail, he had been a farm boy. He had known planting seasons, animals, small-town life. But now he understood things many adults never learned. He understood fear. He understood responsibility. He understood that courage did not mean being unafraid. Courage meant continuing, even when fear was present. One morning, Samuel woke before sunrise. The camp was quiet. The mountains surrounded them. He stepped outside the wagon and looked at the frozen ground. For a moment, he forgot about being tired. He forgot about the difficult journey. The view was breathtaking. Snow-covered peaks reflected the early morning light. The sky seemed endless. He understood why people had dreamed of the West. It was beautiful, dangerous, but beautiful. However, beauty did not protect travelers. The mountains brought new problems. Food supplies became lower. The animals needed more energy. The cold made every task harder. Even simple activities became difficult. Cooking took longer. Finding firewood became harder. Repairing equipment became painful in freezing temperatures. The pioneers discovered that survival was not one big heroic moment. It was thousands of small decisions every single day. Then came the river. A wide, powerful mountain river stood between the wagon train and the route west. The water moved quickly. The current was stronger than anything they had faced before. Everyone became silent. They knew river crossings were among the deadliest moments on the Oregon Trail. A wagon could float away. An animal could panic. A person could disappear beneath the water. There were no bridges, no guaranteed safe path, only judgment and luck. The wagon leaders studied the river for hours. They searched for the shallowest crossing. They tested the current. They watched other groups attempt the journey. Some crossed successfully. Others lost supplies. Everyone waited nervously. When the Carter family's turn arrived, Elizabeth held her children close. Thomas took a deep breath. The oxen stepped forward. The wagon entered the water. Cold water surrounded the wheels. The current pushed against them. For a terrifying moment, the wagon stopped moving. Thomas shouted. The oxen pulled harder. Everyone inside pushed their weight forward. Then, slowly, inch by inch, the wagon moved. They reached the other side. The family survived. But the river left a reminder. The trail was never finished testing them. As they continued through the mountains, the travelers began hearing stories about those who had not survived. A family lost in a storm. A wagon destroyed by a fall. Travelers who became sick and never recovered. Names were written on wooden markers. Sometimes there was no marker at all, only a small pile of stones. The Oregon Trail carried thousands of stories. Many were never recorded, many disappeared with the people who lived them. Finally, after weeks of struggle, the Carter family reached the highest points of the mountain route. Behind them were the plains. Ahead was the land they had dreamed about, Oregon. They had survived one of the hardest parts of the journey, but survival did not mean the danger was over. Because ahead waited the final challenge, the long descent into the West. A land of rivers, forests, and uncertainty. A place where pioneers expected a new beginning. But many would discover that reaching Oregon was not the end of the struggle. It was only the beginning of another fight. The first glimpse of the land beyond the Rocky Mountains changed everything. After months of dust, exhaustion, and uncertainty, the Carter family finally saw something they had imagined since the day they left Missouri. Green valleys, tall forests, running rivers. A landscape that looked almost impossible after the endless plains and brutal mountains. For many pioneers, this moment was the reason they had endured everything. The hunger, the cold, the sickness, the fear. They believed they had reached the promised land. But the Oregon Trail had one final lesson to teach them. The hardest moments often came when people thought they were almost safe. When the wagon train began descending from the mountains, the mood slowly changed. People smiled more, children laughed again, parents talked about farms they would build, families imagined houses, gardens, new communities. The dream that had seemed distant for so long finally felt real. But the trail was not finished. The land ahead still contained dangerous rivers, thick forests, steep paths, and unfamiliar territory. A traveler could survive thousands of miles and still lose everything near the end. Thomas Carter noticed something different about his family. They were no longer the same people who had left Missouri. The journey had changed them. Elizabeth, who once worried about every small problem, had become calm during emergencies. Samuel, who once complained about walking, now helped younger children in the wagon train. Even little Mary, who had cried during the first weeks, had learned the rhythm of frontier life. The Oregon Trail had taken away their comfort, but it had given them strength. The travelers continued westward through the Columbia River region. For many Oregon Trail emigrants, the Columbia River became one of the most dangerous and unforgettable parts of the journey. The river was enormous. Powerful currents moved through the water. Strong winds could create dangerous waves. Early travelers who attempted to travel down the Columbia by boat faced serious risks. Some lost their wagons, some lost supplies, some lost their lives. The river that promised a route to Oregon could also become a deadly barrier. The Carter family reached the river during a period when many other travelers were also arriving. The scene was overwhelming. Hundreds of people, dozens of wagons, animals everywhere, families trying to make decisions. Everyone wanted the same thing, to reach Oregon safely. But crowded conditions created new problems. Supplies became harder to find. People competed for safe crossing points. Rumors spread quickly. Some travelers claimed one route was better. Others warned of dangers ahead. After months on the trail, everyone was tired, and tired people sometimes made dangerous decisions. One evening, Thomas sat beside the campfire with other men from the wagon train. They discussed the future. "How much land will you take?" one man asked. Thomas looked into the flames. "I don't know yet." The man laughed. "After all this distance, you don't know?" Thomas smiled. "I spent months trying to survive each day. I haven't had much time to imagine what comes after." The other men became quiet, because he was right. The Oregon Trail was so difficult that many pioneers focused only on reaching the destination. They had dreamed of Oregon, but they had not always imagined what building a life there would require. When the Carter family finally entered Oregon territory, there was no magical moment, no celebration waiting, no official welcome. The land was beautiful, but it was still wilderness. A new challenge began. They needed shelter, food, tools, seeds, materials. They had escaped the trail, but they had not escaped hard work. The first days in Oregon were filled with decisions. Where should they settle? How would they build a home? What crops could survive? How would they protect themselves during winter? Many pioneers discovered that reaching Oregon was only half the journey. Creating a new life was another battle. Thomas searched for land that could support farming. He walked through fields and examined the soil. He looked at water sources. He studied the landscape. The same skills that had helped him survive the trail now helped him build a future. Elizabeth began organizing their new home. The first shelter was simple, nothing like the house they had left behind. But to them, it represented something powerful, a beginning. That first night in their new settlement, Samuel stepped outside. The forest around him was silent, different from Missouri, different from the plains, different from the mountains. He thought about everything he had seen: the rivers, the storms, the graves along the trail, the families who had started the journey but never finished. He realized something important. The Oregon Trail was not just about reaching a place. It was about becoming someone new along the way. Years later, many pioneers would tell stories about their journey. Some remembered the beauty. Some remembered the suffering. Some remembered the friendships created on the trail. Others remembered the people they lost. The Oregon Trail became one of the greatest migrations in American history. Between the 1840s and 1860s, hundreds of thousands of people traveled west seeking opportunity. They helped establish new communities. They changed the future of the United States. But their journey came with a cost. The trail was built on courage, sacrifice, and countless personal stories. Not every pioneer found success. Some arrived in Oregon and struggled. Some returned east. Some lost farms. Some faced conflicts and hardships they never expected. The dream of the West was real, but it was not easy. The frontier offered opportunity, but it demanded everything in return. For the Carter family, the Oregon Trail remained a memory they carried forever. Years later, Samuel would tell his own children about the journey. He would describe the endless prairie, the terrifying rivers, the mountains covered in snow, the nights beside the campfire. He would tell them about the people who helped strangers, the families who shared food when they had little themselves, the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. And he would always say, "People think the Oregon Trail was about moving west, but it was really about discovering what a person can survive." The story of the Oregon Trail is not just a story of wagons and wilderness. It is a story of human determination, of families who left everything familiar behind, of people who crossed a continent without knowing what waited ahead. They carried their belongings in wooden wagons, but they carried something much heavier inside their hearts: hope. The hope that somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers, beyond the endless road, a better life was waiting. And that hope was powerful enough to move hundreds of thousands of people across one of the harshest landscapes in North America. History often remembers the Oregon Trail through images of wagons crossing wide plains. It remembers explorers, leaders, frontiersmen, men holding maps and guiding wagon trains westward. But behind every wagon that moved across the continent were thousands of people whose stories were rarely recorded. Women, children, elderly parents, ordinary people who carried the daily weight of survival. They were not always the ones making decisions in wagon train meetings. They were not always the names written in history books, but without them, the journey would have been impossible. The Oregon Trail was not built only by those who walked at the front. It was built by everyone who kept moving. Elizabeth Carter discovered this truth quickly. Before the journey, she had imagined the trail as a challenge her husband would handle. Thomas would guide the wagon. Thomas would repair problems. Thomas would protect the family. But after months on the trail, Elizabeth understood something different. Survival depended on everyone. Every person had a role. Every person carried a responsibility. The men repaired wagons and managed animals, but the women were constantly working too. They cooked meals under difficult conditions. They cared for children. They washed clothing in freezing rivers. They preserved food. They repaired torn clothes. They treated injuries. They comforted frightened family members. And they often did all of this while walking hundreds of miles. A pioneer woman's day began before sunrise. There was no modern kitchen, no electricity, no easy way to prepare food. Every meal required effort. A simple breakfast could take hours of preparation. Water had to be collected. Fire had to be built. Ingredients had to be measured carefully because supplies were limited. A mistake could waste precious food. A forgotten supply could create problems weeks later. Women became experts at making something out of almost nothing. A small amount of flour, a little meat, some beans, whatever remained. They turned limited supplies into meals that kept families alive. Elizabeth carried a small cooking pot throughout the journey. It was old. The handle was damaged. The metal was scratched. To another person, it looked worthless, but to Elizabeth, it represented survival. That pot had prepared hundreds of meals. It had been used beside rivers, under storms, during freezing nights, during moments when the family had almost nothing left. It was not valuable because of what it was. It was valuable because of what it had witnessed. Children on the Oregon Trail lived a childhood unlike any children before them. They did not grow up with schools nearby. They did not spend their days playing in safe neighborhoods. Their playground was the wilderness. Their lessons came from survival. Children learned how to care for animals, how to gather firewood, how to recognize dangerous plants, how to avoid getting lost. They learned responsibility at an age when many children today are still learning basic independence. Samuel Carter changed the most. At the beginning of the journey, he was just a boy who missed home. He complained about the dust. He hated the long walks. He wanted the journey to end. But the trail slowly transformed him. One afternoon, another child in the wagon train fell behind. The boy was younger than Samuel and struggling to walk. Without being asked, Samuel slowed down. He walked beside him. He carried some of his supplies. He encouraged him. Thomas watched from the wagon. He realized his son had become someone different. The trail had taken away his childhood innocence, but it had given him maturity. However, childhood on the Oregon Trail was also dangerous. Many children became sick. Some became separated from their families. Some died. The trail was filled with risks that children today would find unimaginable. A moment of carelessness could have terrible consequences. A child wandering too far from camp could disappear. A small illness could become life-threatening. Parents lived with constant fear. One evening, the Carter family experienced that fear. Mary, their youngest child, was missing. At first, Elizabeth thought she was near the wagon. Then she searched around the camp. Nothing. Her heart began racing. The entire wagon train stopped. People picked up lanterns. They searched near the river. They called her name. Mary! Mary! Minutes felt like hours. Finally, Samuel heard something. A small voice, near a group of bushes. He ran toward the sound. Mary was sitting there, frightened but unharmed. She had followed a butterfly and lost track of the camp. Elizabeth held her tightly. That night, no one slept easily. The trail had reminded them how quickly happiness could turn into fear. While families struggled to survive, another group faced a different reality on the Oregon Trail, the native nations whose lands the wagon trains crossed. For thousands of years, native peoples had lived across the Great Plains, mountains, and valleys of the West. They had their own cultures, their own languages, their own histories. The arrival of wagon trains brought enormous change. At first, some encounters were peaceful. Travelers traded goods. They exchanged information. They learned from native guides who understood the land better than any outsider. Many pioneers survived because of knowledge shared by indigenous people. Native people understood the environment in ways newcomers often did not. They knew where water could be found. They knew seasonal weather patterns. They knew which areas were dangerous. They understood the movement of animals. The land that looked empty to pioneers was not empty at all. It was a living world with deep connections and traditions. But as more settlers moved west, tensions increased. Thousands of wagons crossing the same routes changed the landscape. Grasslands were damaged. Animal populations were affected. Competition for resources increased. Different groups with different goals were forced into closer contact. The Oregon Trail was part of a much larger story of American expansion, a story that brought opportunity for some people while creating enormous disruption for others. By the time the Carter family had lived in Oregon for several years, they often thought about the people they met along the way. The travelers who shared food, the strangers who helped repair wagons, the families who continued despite losing loved ones, the native people who knew the land long before the pioneers arrived. The trail was not just a road, it was a meeting place of countless lives. Years later, Samuel would remember one particular night on the trail. The wagon train was camped beneath a sky filled with stars. Hundreds of people sat around small fires. Some were laughing, some were cooking, some were quietly remembering home. Samuel had asked his father, "Do you think we will ever forget this?" Thomas looked around the camp, at the tired faces, the broken wagons, the determined people. "No," he answered. "People forget roads." He paused. "But they never forget what they survived on them." The Oregon Trail created thousands of stories. Some became famous, many disappeared. But every person who crossed it left something behind. A footprint in the dirt, a memory around a campfire, a name written on a forgotten grave, a piece of courage carried forward by future generations. And among all those stories, one of the most powerful truths remained. The Oregon Trail was not conquered by heroes with perfect strength. It was survived by ordinary people who refused to give up. But even after reaching Oregon, many pioneers still carried the scars of the journey. The memories of lost friends, the fear of difficult years, the knowledge that their new home had been purchased with enormous sacrifice. And for some travelers, the journey became famous for a reason darker than survival. A story of hunger, desperation, and one of the most shocking disasters in American frontier history. The Oregon Trail was filled with stories of courage, but it was also filled with warnings. Warnings written in abandoned wagons. Warnings buried beneath simple wooden markers. Warnings carried by survivors who lived through unimaginable suffering. Among all the stories connected to westward migration, few became as famous or as horrifying as the story of the Donner Party. Their journey began with the same dream that inspired thousands of others: a better life in the West, more land, more opportunity, a new beginning. But their dream became one of the darkest chapters in American frontier history. In the spring of 1846, a group of families left Illinois and began traveling west. They were not unusual. They were ordinary Americans with ordinary hopes. They had farms, children, families, possessions they wanted to protect. They believed the West offered a chance that was impossible to find back home. Like many pioneers, they believed careful planning and determination would carry them through. But the frontier had a lesson that many travelers learned too late. Good intentions could not always defeat bad circumstances. The group became known as the Donner Party because two brothers, Jacob and George Donner, were among its leaders. The travelers joined together into a wagon train and began the long journey toward California. At first, everything seemed normal. They followed established routes. They traveled with other immigrants. They faced the same problems every pioneer faced: dust, heat, exhaustion, broken equipment. But then they made a decision that would change everything. The travelers chose a new route called the Hastings Cutoff. It was promoted as a faster way to reach California. The promise was tempting. A shorter route meant arriving earlier. A shorter route meant less time on the trail. A shorter route meant avoiding some difficulties. But there was a serious problem. The route had never been properly tested by a large wagon train. The shortcut was not a shortcut. It was a gamble, and the gamble would cost them dearly. The group entered difficult terrain in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The path was rough. The land was unforgiving. The wagons struggled through areas that were never designed for large groups. Trees blocked the way. Steep slopes slowed progress. The travelers had to cut paths through wilderness. Every day they lost precious time, and time was becoming their greatest enemy. Winter was approaching. For pioneers crossing the West, timing was everything. A wagon train reaching the mountains too late could face disaster. The Donner Party was running out of options. They were trapped between mountains and snow. The beautiful landscape became a prison. In October 1846, heavy snow began falling. At first, the travelers hoped the storm would pass. They had survived difficult conditions before. They believed they could continue. But the snow kept coming. Soon, the mountain passes became impossible to cross. The wagons stopped moving. The journey stopped. The dream stopped. The families were trapped. Imagine the reality of that moment. A group of men, women, and children surrounded by mountains. No nearby town, no stores, no rescue team. Snow covering every direction. Food supplies decreasing every day. The same wilderness that had promised opportunity had now become a place of survival. The Donner Party built temporary camps and waited, but waiting created another problem. Every day consumed more supplies. The food they had carefully saved for the journey was disappearing. Animals died. People became weaker. The cold became unbearable. Families burned belongings for warmth. Furniture, wagons, anything that could create heat. The same items they had carried across thousands of miles became fuel for survival. Inside those camps, people fought against more than hunger. They fought against hopelessness. Parents tried to protect children. Neighbors helped each other. People shared whatever they had. But extreme conditions changed everything. The human body can survive only so long without food. The mind can survive only so much fear. Stories from the Donner Party became famous because of the desperate actions some survivors eventually took. As starvation became severe, some members of the group turned to eating the remains of those who had died. The tragedy shocked the nation. Newspapers spread the story across America. For many people, the Donner Party became a symbol of the dangers hidden behind westward expansion. But the reality was more complicated than the sensational stories often suggested. The survivors were not monsters. They were people trapped in an unimaginable situation. They were families trying to survive conditions that few humans could endure. When rescue groups finally reached them, the rescuers discovered scenes of extreme suffering. Many people had died. Those who survived were weak and exhausted. Children who had begun the journey full of excitement had experienced a nightmare. Families who had dreamed of California had instead fought simply to see another sunrise. The story of the Donner Party spread fear among future pioneers. Travelers became more careful. They studied routes. They listened to warnings. They respected the mountains. Because the lesson was clear, the frontier rewarded preparation, but it punished mistakes. The Carter family heard stories about the Donner Party after settling in Oregon. Samuel was older by then. He listened carefully as travelers described what had happened. He thought about how close every pioneer was to disaster. A broken wagon, a late departure, a wrong route, a harsh winter. Sometimes survival depended on decisions made weeks or months earlier. Thomas Carter often told his children, "The trail does not care how brave you are." He would look toward the mountains. "It does not care how much you hope." Then he would add, "You must respect it." The Donner Party became one of the most remembered tragedies of American migration. But it was not the only danger pioneers faced. Thousands of other families suffered through disasters that never became famous. A child lost to illness, a mother buried beside the trail, a wagon destroyed by a river, a family forced to abandon everything. Their stories were quieter, but their struggles were just as real. The Oregon Trail was never one single experience. For some, it brought success. For others, it brought heartbreak. Some found the land they dreamed about. Some found disappointment. Some returned east. Some disappeared into history. But every traveler carried the same human desire, the hope that tomorrow could be better than today. As the years passed, the great wagon migrations began to decline. New technology was changing America. Railroads would soon replace many wagon routes. The long journey across the continent would become faster, safer, more predictable. But before the railroad connected the nation, thousands of ordinary people crossed the wilderness with nothing but wagons, animals, and determination. They created one of the greatest migration stories in American history. The Oregon Trail was not just a road. It was a test of courage, a test of patience, a test of humanity. And every person who survived it carried a story that deserved to be remembered. But there was another side of the Oregon Trail that many people rarely discuss. The hidden dangers inside the wagon camps, the diseases that killed more pioneers than accidents, the medical struggles, the terrifying reality of giving birth in the middle of nowhere, and the women who became doctors, nurses, and healers when there was nobody else to help. The greatest danger on the Oregon Trail was not always a mountain. It was not always a river. It was not always a violent storm. Sometimes the greatest danger was something travelers could not see, something they could not fight with weapons, something that could enter a wagon camp quietly and change everything within days. Disease. For the thousands of families moving west across America, illness was often a more terrifying enemy than the wilderness itself. A person could survive 1,000 miles of difficult travel and still lose their life because of a simple infection. When pioneers left their homes in the East, many believed the hardest part of the journey would be crossing the land. They imagined dangerous animals, rocky mountains, fast rivers, but many soon discovered that the human body was just as vulnerable as a wooden wagon. The trail created perfect conditions for sickness. Hundreds of people traveled together. They lived close together. They shared water sources. They camped in the same areas. They had limited ability to clean themselves or their surroundings. A small illness could spread quickly through an entire wagon train. There were no modern hospitals along the Oregon Trail, no emergency rooms, no trained medical teams waiting at the next town. A family's health often depended on knowledge passed from one generation to another. Women used traditional remedies. Travelers carried small medical supplies. Some people had experience treating injuries, but most pioneers were forced to become their own doctors. Elizabeth Carter learned this reality during their first year on the trail. One morning, she woke before sunrise and noticed that Samuel was not acting like himself. Normally, he was the first child awake. He would ask questions. He would run around the camp. But that morning, he stayed under his blanket. His face looked tired. His body felt hot. Elizabeth immediately knew something was wrong. A mother on the Oregon Trail could never ignore sickness. There was no guarantee of help, no quick trip to a doctor, no medicine store nearby. Every illness carried fear. Thomas searched through their supplies. They had a small collection of medicines, nothing like what people have today. A few bottles, some herbs, basic treatments, enough to help with minor problems, but not enough to fight every danger. Elizabeth stayed beside Samuel for hours. She cooled his forehead. She encouraged him to drink water. She prayed he would recover. Around them, the wagon train continued moving. But for the Carter family, the journey had temporarily stopped. Many pioneers faced similar moments. The trail was filled with stories of parents watching over sick children, husbands caring for wives, wives caring for husbands, strangers helping people they had met only weeks before. The Oregon Trail created communities because survival required compassion. One of the most feared diseases among travelers was cholera. It could spread rapidly and cause severe dehydration. The symptoms could become dangerous within hours. A healthy person could become extremely weak very quickly. In crowded camps, cholera could move from family to family. The lack of clean water and sanitation made the danger worse. Many pioneers did not understand exactly how diseases spread. They did not know about bacteria or germs the way modern medicine does. They often blamed bad air, weather changes, or other causes. Another serious danger was dysentery. Contaminated food and water could cause severe illness. A person already weakened by months of travel was much more vulnerable. Children were especially at risk. Their smaller bodies could not handle dehydration as easily. For many families, protecting children's health became their greatest daily responsibility. Injuries were also common. The Oregon Trail was physically demanding. People suffered broken bones, cuts, burns, animal-related injuries, wagon accidents. A simple injury that would be treated easily today could become dangerous in the 1840s. A wound could become infected. A person could lose the ability to work. And on the trail, someone unable to work created challenges for the entire family. Women carried one of the heaviest responsibilities because they were often responsible for medical care. They became nurses, caregivers, midwives, healers. A woman who had never imagined herself in such a role might suddenly have to help someone survive. Childbirth on the Oregon Trail was one of the greatest challenges women faced. Some women gave birth inside wagons. Some gave birth beside rivers. Some gave birth in temporary camps. There were no comfortable hospitals, no professional medical teams, no guarantee of safety. A woman could begin the journey pregnant and deliver a child hundreds of miles from her original home. Imagine the courage required. A mother carrying a baby through mountains. A family continuing the journey while caring for a newborn. A woman recovering from childbirth while walking through wilderness. These stories were common among pioneer families, yet they were often left out of traditional histories. Elizabeth remembered one woman in their wagon train named Anna. Anna was expecting a child when the journey began. Many people told her she should not attempt such a difficult trip, but she had no choice. Her husband had already committed to the journey. Their future depended on reaching Oregon. Months later, during a cold night near the mountains, Anna went into labor. The entire camp helped. Women gathered supplies. Men created shelter. Everyone contributed. By morning, a baby was born. A new life had entered the world, in the middle of one of the hardest journeys in American history. The child became a symbol of hope for the entire wagon train. But not every story had a happy ending. For many families, the trail ended with loss. A grave beside the road, a small wooden marker, a name carved into a tree. Many pioneers buried loved ones along the route and continued west because they had no other choice. Stopping permanently could mean losing their own lives. This created one of the most painful realities of the Oregon Trail. People often had to leave behind those they loved. A wagon train could not wait forever. Winter was coming. Supplies were limited. Other families depended on the group moving forward, so pioneers sometimes said goodbye in the middle of nowhere. They continued carrying the memory of those they lost. Samuel Carter never forgot the first grave he saw beside the trail. He was still young. He did not understand why people had to keep walking after someone died. He asked his father, "Why don't they stay?" Thomas looked at the wagon train moving ahead. "Because the living still have to survive." Those words stayed with Samuel forever. Years later, when Samuel was an old man, he wrote about the Oregon Trail. He did not write about only the victories. He wrote about the suffering, the sickness, the fear, the people who never reached the end. Because he believed the forgotten stories mattered. The Oregon Trail was not a story of perfect heroes. It was a story of ordinary people facing impossible circumstances. People who became stronger because they had no other choice. People who discovered courage inside themselves. People who learned that survival was not only about strength, it was about kindness, patience, and helping others when you were struggling yourself. But disease was only one invisible enemy. Another danger followed every wagon train: the psychological battle, the loneliness, the fear, the emotional cost of leaving everything behind. Many pioneers discovered that the hardest miles were not always the physical ones. Sometimes the hardest journey happened inside the human mind. The Oregon Trail was measured in miles, more than 2,000 miles from the starting points in Missouri and other eastern settlements to the valleys of Oregon. But for the people who traveled it, the distance was not only measured by land. It was measured by everything they lost along the way. The birthdays missed, the homes abandoned, the faces they would never see again, the memories that became part of the road behind them. Every pioneer carried two journeys. One journey happened outside, across plains, rivers, and mountains. The other happened inside, in the heart and mind. And sometimes, the second journey was the harder one. By the time the Carter family had spent several months on the trail, Elizabeth noticed something changing. At the beginning, every evening was filled with conversation. People talked about the future. They shared stories about their old homes. They laughed about small problems. They dreamed about Oregon. But after months of hardship, conversations became quieter. The trail had taken energy from everyone. People still hoped. But hope now mixed with exhaustion. Many pioneers experienced something that modern people might recognize as deep homesickness. They missed simple things. Not expensive things, not important things, simple things. The smell of their old kitchen, the sound of familiar neighbors, the comfort of knowing where they belonged. On the trail, everything was uncertain. Every morning brought a new challenge. Every night brought the question, what will tomorrow bring? Elizabeth sometimes thought about the house they had left behind. She remembered the small garden beside the door, the tree where her children used to play, the kitchen table where the family ate together. Those memories became precious because they were gone. She knew they were searching for a better future, but she also understood something painful. A new beginning always requires an ending. Many pioneers carried journals during their journey. Those journals became some of the most valuable historical records of the Oregon Trail. They recorded weather, distances traveled, difficulties, encounters, personal emotions. Through these writings, historians discovered that pioneers were not simply brave travelers. They were human beings. They were afraid. They were tired. They doubted themselves. They missed home. They argued. They cried. They continued anyway. One evening, Samuel found his mother sitting alone near the wagon. She was holding an old letter. It was from a relative back home. "Are you sad?" Samuel asked. Elizabeth smiled gently. "Sometimes. But we are going to Oregon." "Yes, and Oregon will be better." "I hope so." Samuel looked confused. "Then why are you sad?" Elizabeth looked at the stars. "Because when you leave something behind, even for a good reason, you still lose it." Samuel thought about that. He was learning one of the hardest lessons of adulthood. Two feelings can exist at the same time. A person can be excited about the future and still miss the past. The Oregon Trail also tested marriages and family relationships. Living together under normal conditions was one thing. Living together while hungry, exhausted, and afraid was something completely different. Small disagreements could become serious. A husband and wife might argue about decisions. Parents might disagree about the risks their children faced. Travelers might become impatient after weeks of stress. The trail removed privacy. There was nowhere to escape. A person could not simply walk away from problems. They had to continue sharing the same wagon, the same camp, the same journey. Yet the trail also created powerful relationships. Strangers became like family. A person who helped you repair a broken wagon might later save your life. A woman who shared food during a difficult time might become a lifelong friend. A traveler who walked beside your children might become someone you remembered forever. Hardship had a strange effect. It revealed people's true character. One man in the Carter wagon train was named William Harper. At the beginning of the journey, many people considered him unfriendly. He rarely talked. He kept to himself. Some travelers thought he did not care about others. But during a difficult river crossing, everything changed. Another wagon became stuck. The family inside was frightened. Without hesitation, William entered the cold water and helped them. He risked his own safety to save people he barely knew. After that day, nobody saw him the same way. The trail revealed the kindness hidden inside him. This happened often on the Oregon Trail. People discovered abilities they never knew they possessed. A quiet person became a leader. A fearful person became brave. A young person became responsible. A stranger became a friend. The journey changed everyone, but not everyone survived the emotional weight. Some pioneers lost hope. They became unable to continue. A few turned back. Others simply gave up. The dream of the West was powerful, but the reality of reaching it was sometimes overwhelming. The Oregon Trail demanded more than physical strength. It demanded mental endurance. For children, the emotional challenges were especially complicated. Many children did not fully understand why their families had left. They only knew that their old world was gone. Their friends were gone. Their familiar places were gone. The trail became their new reality. Some children adapted quickly, others struggled. Samuel remembered missing his old life during the first months. But later, something surprising happened. The trail itself became home. The wagon became familiar. The campfires became familiar. The people traveling beside him became familiar. The road that once frightened him became part of who he was. One evening, Thomas Carter watched his son helping repair a wagon wheel. He smiled. He remembered the little boy who had complained about walking. Now, Samuel worked like an experienced traveler. The trail had taken years from his childhood, but it had also given him confidence. As the Carter family continued building their new life in Oregon, they often talked about the journey. They remembered the difficult moments, but they also remembered the beauty, the endless stars above the prairie, the incredible silence of the wilderness, the kindness of strangers, the feeling of standing on a mountain after believing they might never reach it. The Oregon Trail contained both suffering and wonder. For many Americans, the trail became a symbol of determination. It represented the belief that people could create new futures. But modern understanding of the Oregon Trail also recognizes another truth. Expansion came with consequences. The movement of settlers changed the lives of native peoples. It transformed landscapes. It created conflicts over land and resources. The story of the Oregon Trail is not only about pioneers chasing dreams. It is also about the many people and cultures affected by that movement west. By the late 1800s, the great wagon migrations began to fade. Railroads replaced many wagon routes. Travel became faster. The frontier changed. But the memory of the Oregon Trail remained. Because the story was never only about wagons, it was about people. People who faced uncertainty. People who lost things. People who kept moving. Years later, Samuel would return to parts of the old trail. He would stand beside places where his family had once camped. He would see roads where wagons once traveled. He would remember faces of people who were no longer alive. And he would think about the question every pioneer eventually asked. Was it worth it? His answer was never simple. Because the Oregon Trail gave people new beginnings. But those beginnings were built on sacrifice. The trail was a road of dreams. But dreams always have a price, and for thousands of pioneers that price was paid mile by mile. With tired feet, broken hearts, and unbelievable courage. But the story of the Oregon Trail still had one more powerful chapter. The trail did not only create settlers, it created legends, it created communities, it created the foundation of the American West. And behind those achievements were thousands of forgotten acts of bravery that shaped the nation. The Oregon Trail began as a path through wilderness, but over time it became something much larger. It became a symbol of movement, a symbol of opportunity, a symbol of the powerful desire people have always carried, the desire to build a better life. But behind the famous stories of westward expansion were millions of small decisions made by ordinary people, farmers who sold their homes, mothers who protected their children, children who learned to survive, workers who repaired wagons in the middle of nowhere, strangers who shared food when they barely had enough for themselves. The American West was not created by a few famous names. It was created by countless people whose stories were often never recorded. Years after arriving in Oregon, Samuel Carter often walked through the fields near his family's home. The land that once seemed impossible to reach had become familiar. The forests, the rivers, the open valleys. The same landscape that had represented uncertainty now represented home. But Samuel never forgot the road that brought him there. The Oregon Trail remained part of his identity. When Samuel looked at his children, he often wondered if they understood what their family had experienced. They had grown up in Oregon. They knew the West as a place of farms, homes, and communities. They did not know the fear of leaving everything behind. They did not know what it felt like to cross mountains without knowing if you would survive. They did not know what it meant to wake every morning wondering if your family would make it another day. So Samuel told them stories, not because he wanted them to admire him, but because he wanted them to remember. He told them about the first day they left Missouri. He told them about the endless plains. He told them about the rivers that almost took their supplies. He told them about the mountains covered in snow. He told them about the people who helped them. And he always told them about the people who never arrived, because Samuel believed the forgotten deserved to be remembered. The Oregon Trail was one of the largest migrations in American history. From the 1830s through the 1860s, hundreds of thousands of people traveled west. They followed routes that crossed what would become several modern states. They moved through areas that seemed impossible to cross. They traveled farther than many people of their time could have imagined. Their movement changed the population of the continent. It changed economies. It changed politics. It changed the future of the United States. Journey West was not simply a story of success. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent, encouraged many settlers to move west. For pioneers, it often represented hope and opportunity. But for native nations already living across these lands, expansion brought enormous challenges. Their territories changed. Their resources were affected. Their communities faced pressure and displacement. The same movement that created new opportunities for settlers created hardship for many indigenous peoples. Understanding the Oregon Trail means understanding both sides of this history. The wagon trains traveled through lands that had existed long before the pioneers arrived. Native nations had established trade routes. They had deep knowledge of the environment. They had traditions connected to the land. the arrival of thousands of settlers changed the balance of these regions forever. Some pioneers respected the native peoples they encountered. They learned from them. They traded with them. They depended on their knowledge. Others brought fear, misunderstanding, and conflict. The meetings between cultures were complex. They were moments of cooperation and tension, friendship and disagreement, exchange and loss. The Oregon Trail was not just a road through nature, it was a road through human history. As more settlers reached Oregon, towns began forming. Small communities grew. Farms appeared. Businesses opened. Schools were created. Churches were built. The wilderness slowly transformed into settlements. Many pioneers who had suffered on the trail became the builders of new communities. The skills they learned during the journey helped them survive. They knew how to repair equipment, how to manage limited resources, how to work together, how to face uncertainty. The trail had trained them for frontier life. Elizabeth Carter became known in her community as a woman who could handle almost anything. People came to her for advice. They respected her experience. Young families asked her questions about farming, food preservation, and surviving difficult seasons. But Elizabeth always remembered the person she had been before the journey. A woman who was afraid. A woman who wondered if she had made the right choice. A woman who cried quietly when she missed home. The trail did not remove fear. It taught her how to live with it. Thomas Carter continued farming for many years. His hands remained strong from hard work. He never forgot the weight of the wagon he pulled across the continent. Sometimes when he heard wagon wheels passing nearby, he would stop and listen. The sound reminded him of another time, a time when every mile was uncertain. One evening, years after arriving in Oregon, Thomas sat outside with Samuel. The sun was setting over the fields. The land was peaceful. Nothing about the scene looked dangerous, but both of them remembered when this kind of peace seemed impossible. Samuel asked his father, "Would you do it again?" Thomas was silent for a long time. He looked across the land they had built their life on. Then he answered, "I would never forget what it cost." He paused. "But I understand why we went." That answer represented the feelings of many pioneers. The Oregon Trail was not simply a success story. It was not simply a tragedy. It was both. It was a story of hope and suffering, a story of courage and consequence, a story of people searching for something better while facing enormous challenges. Today, the Oregon Trail remains one of the most studied journeys in American history. Visitors still walk portions of the original routes. Historians study diaries and letters. Museums preserve wagons and artifacts. Each piece of evidence tells a small part of a much larger story. A story about human determination. The wagons are gone. The camps are gone. The voices of many travelers are gone. But the questions they faced remain familiar. How far would you travel for a better future? What would you leave behind? What would you risk for hope? Those questions made the Oregon Trail powerful, because beneath the history was something deeply human. The desire to believe tomorrow could be better. The Carter family was only one family among thousands. Their story was not famous. Their names did not appear in every history book. But their experience represented the lives of countless pioneers, ordinary people who faced extraordinary challenges. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the Oregon Trail. History is not only made by presidents, generals, or famous explorers. Sometimes history is made by a mother protecting her children, a father repairing a broken wagon, a child walking beside a tired animal, a stranger offering help beside a dangerous river. The future of a nation can be shaped by people whose names the world never remembers. But even after the Oregon Trail changed America, one mystery remained. What was daily life really like inside those wagons? What did pioneers eat? How did they sleep? What did they carry? What did they fear? What small details reveal the true reality of traveling across the frontier? When people imagine the Oregon Trail today, they often picture a simple scene: a wagon, a family, a long road stretching toward the west. But the reality inside those wagons was far more complicated. The Oregon Trail was not lived in dramatic moments alone. Most of pioneer life was made up of thousands of ordinary tasks repeated every day. Cooking, walking, repairing, cleaning, searching, waiting, surviving. The great adventure was actually a collection of small struggles, and those small struggles reveal what life was truly like for the people who crossed America before the modern world existed. Samuel Carter was an old man when he first realized how much people misunderstood the Oregon Trail. Young people would ask him about his journey. They imagined exciting adventures. They imagined every day was filled with discovery. They imagined pioneers were constantly fighting danger. Samuel would smile, because he knew the truth. Most days were not dramatic. Most days were simply hard work. The real challenge was waking up every morning and doing what needed to be done, even when you were tired, even when you were afraid, even when you missed home. A typical pioneer morning began before sunrise. There were no alarms, no clocks beside the bed. People woke naturally with the sounds of the camp, animals moving, people preparing breakfast, the first light appearing over the horizon. The day could not begin until the animals were ready. Oxen needed to be fed and attached to the wagons. Horses needed attention. Equipment needed inspection. A small problem discovered early could prevent a disaster later. The wagon itself was the center of pioneer life. It was transportation, storage, shelter, and sometimes a bedroom. The prairie schooner was not designed for comfort. It was designed for survival. Inside, families stored everything they owned: food supplies, clothing, tools, blankets, personal items. The space was crowded. A family could not bring everything they wanted. They had to bring what they needed. Many people today imagine pioneers sitting comfortably inside their wagons while traveling. But that was rarely true. Most people walked beside the wagon. The roads were too rough. The animals were already working hard. The wagons were not built like modern vehicles. They were slow. They were uncomfortable. And riding inside for long periods could be painful. Children sometimes rode when they were tired. Women sometimes rode while caring for babies. But most of the journey happened on foot. Walking became part of everyday life. Imagine waking up and knowing you would walk all day, not through a city, not on a sidewalk, but through dust, mud, heat, cold, for weeks, for months. The human body had to adapt. Feet became damaged, shoes wore out, clothing became dirty and repaired repeatedly. The trail changed people physically. Clothing was another constant challenge. Pioneers did not have large wardrobes. Most people brought only a few outfits. Those clothes had to survive the entire journey. Women repaired clothing constantly. Tears were common. Shoes became worn. Fabric became damaged by weather. A person's ability to repair clothing could be as important as their ability to cook. Elizabeth Carter became skilled at making old clothing last. She learned how to patch holes, how to reuse fabric, how to protect clothing from weather. A damaged shirt was not thrown away. It was repaired. Everything had value. Nothing was wasted. Food on the Oregon Trail was simple but carefully planned. Pioneers depended on foods that could survive long travel. Flour was one of the most important supplies. It could become bread, biscuits, or other meals. Bacon was popular because it lasted longer than fresh meat. Beans provided energy. Coffee became one of the most valued items because it gave travelers comfort and a sense of normal life. A cup of coffee beside a campfire might seem like a small thing, but for pioneers, small comforts mattered. A familiar taste, a moment of peace, a short break from hardship. These little pieces of normal life helped people continue. Cooking on the trail was difficult. There were no kitchens, no ovens, no convenient tools. Meals were prepared outdoors. Weather could make cooking difficult. Wind could destroy fires. Rain could ruin supplies. Finding firewood was sometimes a challenge. The simple act of preparing dinner could require hours of work. Water was one of the most important resources. A wagon train's route often depended on access to water. Travelers searched for rivers, streams, and springs. But water could also bring danger. Contaminated water caused illness. Crossing rivers could destroy supplies. Too little water could threaten survival. Every stop required careful decisions. Entertainment was rare, but pioneers found ways to create moments of happiness. People sang songs, they told stories, they played simple games, they shared memories. Music became especially important. A song around a campfire could remind people that they were still human, not just travelers, not just survivors. Children often created their own entertainment. They played near wagons. They collected interesting objects. They explored nearby areas. They watched animals. They turned the wilderness into their playground. But parents always watched carefully. The frontier was beautiful. It was also dangerous. The nights on the Oregon Trail were unforgettable. After the work ended, families gathered near fires. The darkness felt enormous. Without city lights, the sky appeared endless. Millions of stars filled the night. Many pioneers wrote about the beauty of those moments. The same wilderness that frightened them during the day became peaceful at night. But even peaceful nights carried worries. People worried about weather. They worried about supplies. They worried about animals. They worried about the future. The trail never completely allowed people to relax. Security was another concern. Wagon trains often organized themselves for protection. They created systems for watching the camp. People took turns staying awake. They protected animals and supplies. The wilderness was unpredictable. A moment of carelessness could create serious problems. One night during the Carter family's journey, Thomas was assigned to watch duty. The camp was quiet. Most people were asleep. The fire slowly burned. Thomas looked around at the wagons, at the families sleeping inside, at the children who had no idea how much danger surrounded them. He realized something important. Every person in the wagon train was depending on everyone else. The trail connected them. That was one of the strange truths about the Oregon Trail. The journey was incredibly individual. Every family had their own reasons, their own dreams, their own fears, but survival was collective. People needed each other. The Oregon Trail created a temporary society moving across the continent. It had leaders, rules, responsibilities, arguments, friendships. People who had been strangers became neighbors. People who had never worked together became a community. But as the years passed and the great wagon migrations ended, many of these daily details disappeared. The difficult mornings, the simple meals, the repaired clothing, the endless walking, the small acts of courage. Those were the parts of the Oregon Trail that rarely appeared in heroic stories. Yet those ordinary moments were the true foundation of survival. Because the Oregon Trail was not survived by one great act of bravery. It was survived by thousands of small acts repeated every day. A mother preparing food, a father fixing a wheel, a child carrying water, a stranger offering help, a tired traveler choosing to continue. The people of the Oregon Trail did not know they were making history. They were simply trying to survive. But decades later, their journey became one of America's most powerful stories. A story of movement, a story of sacrifice, a story of human endurance. And still, one question remains. After traveling thousands of miles, after losing friends, after facing hunger and danger, what happened to the pioneers after they arrived? Did they truly find the paradise they imagined? Or did they discover that creating a new life was even harder than reaching it? For many pioneers, the moment they reached Oregon was supposed to be the end of the struggle. They had imagined it for months. Some had dreamed about it for years. The moment when the wagon finally stopped. The moment when they could step onto their own land. The moment when they could say, "We made it." But the truth was different. The Oregon Trail did not end when the wagons stopped moving. It simply changed. The battle against distance became a battle against the unknown. The wilderness they had crossed became the wilderness they had to transform. When the Carter family first arrived in Oregon, they experienced something they had not felt in months. Silence. Not the frightening silence of an empty prairie. Not the tense silence before a storm. A peaceful silence. They could finally stand still. No need to pack before sunrise. No need to count miles. No need to worry about reaching the next river before darkness. For the first time in a long time, tomorrow did not mean another dangerous journey, but peace did not mean ease. Their first home was nothing like the house they had left behind. There were no finished rooms, no comfortable furniture, no organized kitchen, no familiar surroundings. There was only land, a place full of possibilities and problems. They needed shelter, food, tools, protection from weather. The same determination that carried them west would now be needed to build a life. Many pioneers arrived in Oregon with unrealistic expectations. They had heard stories about rich soil and endless opportunities. Some imagined that success would come quickly, but the frontier demanded patience. Land had to be cleared, crops had to be planted, buildings had to be constructed, animals had to be raised. Every achievement required effort. The West offered opportunity, but it did not offer comfort. Thomas Carter understood this immediately. The first year was the hardest. He spent long days working the land. He cut wood, built fences, repaired tools, prepared fields. The same hands that had repaired wagon wheels now built a permanent home. The journey had changed him from a farmer into a frontier builder. Elizabeth faced her own challenges. A house was not created only with wood and nails. It was created through countless daily tasks. She organized supplies, preserved food, created a kitchen, made clothing last, cared for children, built relationships with neighbors. A community did not appear overnight. It was created by people who worked together. The first winter in Oregon tested many settlers. After months of traveling, many expected life to become easier. Instead, they discovered a different kind of struggle. Weather, limited supplies, isolation, unfamiliar conditions. Some families became sick. Some struggled to grow enough food. Some realized they were not prepared for the reality of frontier life. The pioneers had crossed mountains, but now they faced something just as difficult: building permanence. On the trail, survival meant moving forward. On the frontier, survival meant staying. Samuel noticed the difference. When he was younger, he believed the hardest part of life was traveling. But now he understood something deeper. A journey has a destination. Building a life does not. Every day brought new responsibilities. Every season brought new challenges. As settlements grew, communities began forming. People built roads, created markets, established schools, opened small businesses. Churches and meeting places appeared. The wilderness slowly became society. But the process was not simple. Different groups arrived in Oregon with different hopes. Farmers wanted land. Business owners wanted opportunity. Religious groups wanted communities. Adventurers wanted new experiences. The West attracted people searching for many different things. But all of them faced the same reality. A new land required new effort. The arrival of settlers also created deep conflicts. The growth of American settlements changed the lives of native peoples who had lived in these regions for generations. Land that settlers viewed as available was already connected to indigenous communities, traditions, and histories. As more settlers arrived, competition over land and resources increased. Treaties, conflicts, and government policies reshaped the West. The story of Oregon's development included both opportunity and loss. Samuel learned this as he grew older. He realized the story of the Oregon Trail was more complicated than the stories people often told. It was not only about brave pioneers. It was also about the people already living on those lands. It was about change. Sometimes positive, sometimes painful, sometimes both at the same time. Years after arriving, Samuel visited places where native communities had lived for generations. He thought about the first travelers who crossed those lands. Many pioneers had seen the West as an empty space, waiting to be filled. But Samuel understood something different. A place is never truly empty. Every land has a history. Every landscape has stories. As the years passed, the Carter family became part of Oregon. Their children grew up knowing the West as home. They planted roots. They created friendships. They became members of a growing community. The road that once represented uncertainty became a memory. But the pioneers never completely escaped the trail. The experience stayed with them. They carried it in their stories, in their habits, in their values. Many pioneers became known for independence and determination because the trail had taught them those qualities. One evening, when Samuel was an adult, he sat with his father outside their home. The sun was setting over the fields, the same kind of sunset they had watched thousands of miles earlier. Samuel asked, "Do you ever miss the old days?" Thomas laughed softly. "The old days? The journey." Thomas looked surprised. "You mean the cold nights, the broken wagons, the hunger?" Samuel smiled. "Yes, even those." Thomas looked toward the horizon. Then he nodded. "People miss difficult times sometimes." "Why?" "Because difficult times remind you what you survived." The Oregon Trail became more than a path. It became a shared memory for an entire generation. The people who traveled it carried stories that shaped American identity. Stories of courage, stories of sacrifice, stories of determination. But as the 19th century continued, the world began changing. The same nation that had been crossed by wagon trains was entering a new age. Railroads were expanding, cities were growing, Technology was transforming travel. The era of the wagon trail was coming to an end. The sound of wooden wheels would slowly disappear. The long months of travel would become shorter journeys. The wilderness routes would become roads and rail lines. A new America was being created. But before that happened, the Oregon Trail had already left its mark. The pioneers who crossed it proved something powerful. Ordinary people could face extraordinary challenges. They could lose almost everything and still continue. They could enter unknown territory and create something new. The Oregon Trail was not easy. It was not romantic. It was not a simple adventure. It was a human struggle, a story written by tired feet, broken hands, hopeful hearts, and endless determination. And yet, thousands of people chose that difficult road, because deep inside every wagon was the same belief: maybe somewhere ahead, life could be better. But there is still one final piece of the story. The Oregon Trail did not disappear when the wagons stopped. It became a legend, a symbol, a reminder of a time when ordinary people crossed a continent with courage as their greatest possession. More than a century has passed since the great wagon trains crossed the American frontier. The wooden wheels that once carved paths through the wilderness are gone. The voices of most pioneers have disappeared. The camps where families rested beneath the stars have been replaced by highways, towns, and cities. But the Oregon Trail remains, not as a road, not as a simple line on a map, but as a memory, a story, a symbol of what people are willing to endure when they believe something better is waiting ahead. When Samuel Carter became an old man, he often wondered how history would remember the pioneers. Would people understand what they truly experienced? Would they understand the fear, the uncertainty, the sacrifices? Or would they only remember the exciting parts? The wagons, the mountains, the adventure? Samuel knew the truth was more complicated. The Oregon Trail was not a simple adventure. It was a human experience filled with both beauty and suffering. The pioneers were often portrayed as fearless people who marched west without hesitation. But Samuel knew that was not true. He remembered the fear in his mother's eyes before leaving home. He remembered his father silently worrying about supplies. He remembered children crying because they missed familiar places. He remembered families standing beside graves on the trail. The pioneers were not fearless. They were afraid. They simply continued anyway. That was the true meaning of courage on the Oregon Trail. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was moving forward while carrying fear with you. Every mile represented a choice: continue or give up. Every sunrise brought another opportunity to survive. As America grew, the Oregon Trail became part of the national story. Books were written, paintings were created, museums preserved artifacts. Generations learned about pioneers crossing the continent. The trail became connected with ideas of determination and exploration. But historians continued discovering more complex stories. They studied pioneer diaries, letters, government records, native histories, archaeological evidence. These sources revealed a fuller picture. The Oregon Trail was not only about settlers seeking opportunity. It was also about the transformation of an entire continent. Thousands of native people were affected by westward migration. Their lands changed. Their communities faced pressure. Their traditional ways of life were disrupted. The movement of settlers was a major turning point in American history. Understanding the Oregon Trail means remembering all the people connected to that history, not only those who traveled west, but also those who already called the West home. The trail also changed the lives of women in ways that historians later recognized. For many years, their contributions received little attention, but without women's work, wagon journeys would have been impossible. They cooked, they cared for children, they treated illnesses, they managed supplies, they held families together during moments of fear and uncertainty. Their strength was not always dramatic. Often, it was quiet, but it was essential. Children of the Oregon Trail also left behind important stories. Many grew up faster than children today. They experienced hardship at young ages. They saw things no child should have to see. But they also developed independence. They learned responsibility. They became the next generation of settlers, builders, and community leaders. The Oregon Trail created a unique generation of Americans, people who had experienced uncertainty but learned resilience, people who had lost homes but built new ones, people who had faced the unknown and discovered their own strength. By the late 1800s, the wagon era was ending. The railroad transformed transportation across America. A journey that once required months could now be completed much faster. The old trails became less important for travel, but they became more important for memory. The abandoned wagon tracks slowly disappeared. Grass grew over old paths. Weather erased signs of passing travelers. Nature began reclaiming the routes, but history preserved the stories. Today, when people visit sections of the Oregon Trail, they are often surprised by one thing. The land feels quiet, peaceful, almost ordinary. It is difficult to imagine thousands of people crossing those same areas with wagons, animals, and limited supplies. It is difficult to imagine the exhaustion, the fear, the determination, but that is what makes the story powerful. The landscape looks calm because the struggle has passed, but the memory remains. The Carter family's story was never recorded in official history books. They were not famous leaders. They did not appear in monuments. They were simply one family among thousands. But their experience represents something larger. A mother who protected her children. A father who refused to give up. A boy who grew up on the trail. A family that believed tomorrow could be better. That is why the Oregon Trail continues to interest people today. Because beneath the historical facts is a question that still feels personal. What would you risk for a better future? Would you leave everything familiar? Would you walk thousands of miles into uncertainty? Would you continue when the road became harder than you imagined? The pioneers answered those questions with their actions. They left homes, they crossed rivers, they climbed mountains, they faced disease, they survived loss, they built communities. But perhaps the greatest lesson of the Oregon Trail is not about moving west. It is about human endurance. Every generation faces its own difficult roads, different challenges, different uncertainties, different fears. But the spirit that carried pioneers across the continent remains familiar. The belief that hardship does not have to be the end, that people can adapt, that people can rebuild, that people can continue. The Oregon Trail was a road of impossible distances, but it was traveled one step at a time, one wagon wheel rotation at a time, one difficult day at a time. And that is how history is often created. Not through one dramatic moment, but through ordinary people making difficult choices every day. The pioneers did not know they were becoming legends. They were simply trying to survive. But history remembered them, not because their journey was easy, because it was almost impossible. The Oregon Trail was never just about reaching Oregon. It was about the journey itself, the friendships created, the sacrifices made, the lessons learned, the people lost, the lives rebuilt. Long after the final wagon crossed the frontier, one truth remained. The road changed America, but the road also changed the people who traveled it. They started as ordinary families searching for opportunity. They ended as survivors who had discovered their own strength. The wheels stopped turning, the camps disappeared, the pioneers became memories. But the story of the Oregon Trail continues, because every generation understands the same human desire to search for something better, to hope, to endure. Long after the last wagon disappeared into the western horizon, something strange happened. The trail itself began to vanish. Grass covered the wagon tracks. Rain washed away deep wheel marks. Trees grew where travelers once rested. The sounds of thousands of footsteps slowly faded, but the stories remained. Across America, there are still places where the Oregon Trail can be felt. Places where the land remembers. Where a person can stand quietly and imagine the families who passed through more than 150 years ago. For Samuel Carter, the most powerful memories were never about the destination. They were about specific places along the way. A river where his family almost lost everything. A mountain where they thought they might never continue. A campsite where strangers became friends. The trail was not just a road. It was a collection of moments. One of the most important landmarks on the Oregon Trail was Independence, Missouri. For thousands of pioneers, this was where the great journey began. Families arrived from different parts of America, carrying supplies, animals, and dreams. The town became a gathering point, a place where people prepared for the unknown. Before leaving, travelers purchased final supplies. They repaired wagons. They exchanged information. They said goodbye to the familiar world. Standing in Independence, many pioneers experienced a strange mixture of emotions: excitement, fear, hope, doubt. The journey ahead was enormous. Most knew they were leaving civilization behind. Once they moved west, there would be no easy return. The first weeks often created the strongest emotional conflict. At the beginning, the excitement of adventure was still alive. The road was new. The landscape was impressive. Every new sight felt meaningful. But eventually, the reality appeared. The distance, the difficulty, the uncertainty. The Oregon Trail slowly transformed from an adventure into a test. Another famous area along the route was the Great Plains. To modern travelers, the plains may look peaceful, open, beautiful, endless. But to pioneers, the plains represented both opportunity and danger. The land could provide food and space, but it could also bring storms, extreme temperatures, and isolation. The prairie had a unique power. During the day, it seemed endless. At night, it became almost overwhelming. The sky appeared larger than anything many travelers had ever seen. Without city lights, the stars filled every part of the darkness. Many pioneers wrote about those nights. They felt small. They felt connected to something much larger than themselves. But beauty did not remove danger. The plains could change quickly. A warm day could become freezing. A calm sky could become a violent storm. A healthy animal could suddenly become too weak to continue. Nature controlled the journey. One of the most difficult parts of the trail was crossing major rivers. The Platte River became one of the most important waterways along the route. Travelers followed it because it provided guidance and access to water. But the river also created challenges. Crossing required careful planning. A mistake could destroy supplies needed for survival. Pioneers developed different methods for crossing rivers. Some built makeshift rafts, some used floating wagons, some waited for safer conditions. Others took enormous risks because they feared losing valuable time. Every decision carried consequences. The trail also passed through areas that became famous because of the landmarks travelers used for navigation. Places like Chimney Rock became symbols of hope. When pioneers saw these landmarks, they knew they were making progress. For tired travelers, a recognizable landmark could bring enormous encouragement. It meant, we are still moving. We are still alive. We are getting closer. Imagine traveling for months without modern maps or GPS. Imagine depending on natural landmarks to know where you are: a mountain, a river, a rock formation, a distant peak. These were not just scenery, they were guides. For many pioneers, seeing Chimney Rock was an emotional moment. They had survived the plains, they had traveled hundreds of miles, they had faced uncertainty. The landmark represented progress, but it also reminded them of how much farther they still had to go. The trail continued toward the Rocky Mountains. This was where many travelers experienced their greatest fear. The mountains looked beautiful from a distance, but beauty could hide danger. Steep paths, snow, thin air, difficult terrain. The mountains demanded everything from travelers and animals. Mountain crossings created some of the strongest memories among pioneers. Families remembered the cold, the exhaustion, the silence. They remembered looking back and realizing how far they had traveled. They remembered looking forward and wondering what challenges remained. The Oregon Trail was not only difficult because of distance. It was difficult because every stage introduced something new. The plains tested patience, the rivers tested judgment, the mountains tested strength, the final valleys tested preparation. As Samuel grew older, he sometimes visited areas connected to the old trail. He noticed something surprising. The places that once caused fear now looked peaceful. A river that once threatened lives now flowed calmly. A mountain pass that once seemed impossible now looked quiet. Time changed the landscape, but it did not change the history. Samuel once told his grandchildren, "Places remember people." They laughed. They thought he meant that places had memories like humans, but he explained, when people struggle somewhere, when people sacrifice something somewhere, that place becomes part of their story. The Oregon Trail contained thousands of such places. Some were famous, many were unknown. A small hill where someone rested, a riverbank where a family camped, a field where someone planted a first crop, a lonely grave beside the road. Every location held a human story, a mother's worry, a father's determination, a child's curiosity, a traveler's kindness, a family's hope. Today, historians continue studying these places. They examine old diaries. They research artifacts. They preserve remaining sections of the trail, because every discovery adds another piece to the larger story. The Oregon Trail was not created by machines. It was created by footsteps, by people walking into uncertainty, by families carrying everything they owned toward an unknown future. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about the trail is this: most pioneers were not famous. They were not explorers searching for glory. They were ordinary people. Yet ordinary people accomplished something extraordinary. Their journey reminds us that history is often created quietly. A person making one difficult decision, a family continuing one more mile, a community helping one another survive. The footprints of those travelers may have disappeared from the ground, but their courage remains. However, there is another side of the Oregon Trail story that is often misunderstood. Not everyone traveling west was chasing the same dream. Not every pioneer came for the same reason. Some were searching for farmland. Some were searching for religious freedom. Some were searching for wealth. Some were escaping hardship. And some were forced into a new world they did not choose. When people hear the words Oregon Trail, many imagine one type of person, a farmer, a family, a wagon heading west. But the reality was much more complicated. The people who traveled the Oregon Trail came from different backgrounds, different regions, and different walks of life. They carried different dreams. They faced different struggles. They had different reasons for leaving everything they knew behind. But they all shared one thing: the belief that somewhere beyond the horizon, a different life was possible. The Carter family was only one example. They left because they wanted opportunity. They wanted land. They wanted a future where their children could have more chances than they had. But other families had completely different motivations. Some were searching for religious freedom. Some wanted economic opportunity. Some were escaping difficult conditions. Some simply believed the West represented a new beginning. During the 1840s and 1850s, America was changing rapidly. The population was growing. Land in older eastern settlements was becoming harder to obtain. Many young families struggled to find affordable farmland. For farmers, the West seemed like a place of possibility. Stories about Oregon's fertile valleys spread across the country. People heard about land where crops could grow and families could build permanent homes. But those stories often left out important details. The land was not waiting empty. The journey was not easy. Success was not guaranteed. Many pioneers discovered that the West demanded as much work as the places they left behind. The difference was that in the West, they believed their hard work could create something of their own. For many families, owning land was the greatest dream. In the 19th century, land represented independence. A person who owned land could grow crops, raise animals, build a home, support a family. It represented security. It represented respect. That dream motivated thousands to take the Oregon Trail, but not everyone had the same experience. Some pioneers arrived and succeeded. Others struggled. Some found fertile land. Others discovered difficult conditions. Some built prosperous farms. Others returned east disappointed. Another important group of travelers were immigrants. Many people who came to America from other countries joined the westward movement. They brought different languages, different traditions, different experiences. The Oregon Trail became a meeting place of many cultures. Imagine a wagon camp at night, one family speaking English, another speaking German, another speaking another language entirely, different foods, different customs, different stories. Yet everyone sat around the same fires. Everyone faced the same dangers. The trail created unexpected connections between people who might never have met otherwise. Religious groups also played a major role in westward migration. Some traveled because they wanted to create communities where they could practice their beliefs freely. The West represented a place where they could establish a new society. One of the most famous examples involved members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, many of whom traveled west to settle in what is now Utah. Although their journey followed different routes than the Oregon Trail in many cases, their migration was part of the same larger movement of Americans seeking new homes in the West. These journeys showed something important about America during that period. People were willing to travel enormous distances for ideas, not only for money, not only for land, but for belonging, for freedom, for identity. Women played a central role in every type of westward migration. They were not simply passengers. They were active participants. They made decisions. They managed households. They contributed labor. They helped create communities. Many women wrote diaries that later became some of the most valuable historical records of the Oregon Trail. Through their writings, we see details often missing from official histories. They wrote about exhaustion, loneliness, excitement, fear, beauty, loss. Their words showed the emotional reality of the journey. One pioneer woman wrote about watching the landscape change day after day. At first, she missed the trees and familiar scenery of home. But later, she began appreciating the beauty of the open plains. Her feelings changed as the journey changed her. This happened to many travelers. The trail reshaped their understanding of the world. Children also represented a major part of the migration. Thousands of children traveled west with their families. For them, the journey became the foundation of their childhood memories. Some remembered hardship. Others remembered adventure. Many remembered the strange mixture of danger and freedom. A child growing up on the Oregon Trail might spend one day walking beside a wagon and the next day exploring a completely unfamiliar landscape. They saw animals and places that most people back home would never see. They learned skills at young ages. They became comfortable with uncertainty. But there were also people whose stories are less commonly discussed. The workers who helped wagon trains, the guides who knew the land, the traders who supported travelers, the people who provided services along the routes. The Oregon Trail was not only a movement of families, it was an entire system of people connected by migration. Native guides and knowledge holders were especially important. Many pioneers depended on indigenous knowledge about geography, weather, plants, animals, and travel routes. The West was not unknown to everyone. Native peoples had lived with and understood these landscapes for generations. Yet the arrival of settlers brought dramatic changes. The same trail that represented hope for pioneers represented disruption for many native communities. New settlements changed land use. Competition increased. Government policies transformed relationships between groups. The history of the Oregon Trail cannot be understood without recognizing these complex realities. The people who traveled west were not all heroes. They were not all villains. They were human. They made decisions based on their hopes, fears, beliefs, and circumstances. They created opportunities. They also created challenges. History is rarely simple. Years later, Samuel Carter understood this better than most. When people asked him about the Oregon Trail, he did not only tell stories about his family. He talked about everyone, the people who helped, the people who suffered, the people whose lives changed forever. He once told his grandchildren, every wagon carried more than supplies. They asked, "What else did it carry?" Samuel looked toward the horizon. Dreams. Each wagon carried a different dream. A farmer carried the dream of land. A mother carried the dream of protecting her children. A young person carried the dream of independence. A religious traveler carried the dream of a new community. A struggling family carried the dream of starting again. That is what made the Oregon Trail so powerful. It was not one journey. It was thousands of journeys happening at the same time, but every dream faced the same enemy: distance. The farther pioneers traveled, the more they learned that the West was not simply a destination. It was a transformation. The trail changed people before they ever arrived. And among all the people who traveled west, there were some whose stories became almost unbelievable. People who survived disasters. People who crossed impossible distances. people who showed courage in moments when survival seemed impossible. Their stories became legends of the frontier. The Oregon Trail created thousands of stories. Some were stories of success, some were stories of tragedy, some were stories of people who disappeared and were never heard from again. But among all those memories, certain stories survived because they revealed something extraordinary about human endurance. They showed what happened when ordinary people were pushed beyond what they believed they could survive. The pioneers who traveled west were not superheroes. They were farmers, parents, children, workers, people who had never imagined themselves as explorers. Many had no experience with wilderness. Many had never traveled far from their hometowns. Yet circumstances forced them to learn skills they never expected to need. They learned how to navigate, how to repair equipment, how to survive hunger, how to make impossible decisions. One of the most remarkable things about Oregon Trail history is how often survival depended on ordinary people helping each other. A broken wagon could stop a family forever, but a stranger with tools could save the journey. A sick traveler could lose hope, but a neighbor with medicine could make the difference. A frightened child could become lost, but another traveler could bring them home. The trail created countless moments of quiet heroism. Samuel Carter remembered one such moment. It happened during a difficult stretch of the journey when the wagon train was already exhausted. The animals were weak. Supplies were becoming limited. Everyone was focused on reaching the next safe location. Then, disaster struck. A wagon wheel broke. Not a small problem. A broken wheel could end a family's journey. Without a functioning wagon, supplies could not be carried. The family could not keep pace. They could be forced to abandon everything. The owner of the wagon was a man named Daniel Wilson. He was traveling with his wife and 3 children. When the wheel broke, Daniel stood silently beside the wagon. He looked at the broken wood. Then he looked at the long road ahead. For a moment, he seemed defeated. But before he could begin repairing it, several travelers walked over. One brought tools. Another brought spare material. Another helped lift the wagon. Within hours, strangers had repaired something that belonged to someone they barely knew. Nobody asked for payment. Nobody expected a reward. They helped because they understood. Tomorrow, it might be their wagon. That was one of the unwritten rules of the trail. Everyone's survival was connected. But not every challenge could be solved by teamwork. Some dangers were too powerful. Weather was one of them. The pioneers were constantly at the mercy of nature. A storm could destroy supplies. A drought could weaken animals. An early winter could trap entire groups. The land was beautiful, but it was not forgiving. The mountain regions created some of the most dangerous moments. Snow was especially feared. A wagon train arriving too late could face disaster. Travelers had to calculate every delay. A lost day here, a broken wagon there, a sick family member. Small problems could create a chain reaction. This was one reason the Donner Party became such a powerful warning. Their tragedy showed how quickly a journey could change. A decision that seemed reasonable at one moment could become disastrous later. The frontier demanded humility. It reminded people that nature was stronger than human plans. But not all survival stories came from disasters. Some came from determination. There were pioneers who continued despite losing almost everything. Families who rebuilt after fires, travelers who recovered after illness, people who started over again after failure. One example was the experience of many widows on the frontier. Some women lost husbands during the journey. Suddenly, they became responsible for children, supplies, and survival. Many people underestimated them. But countless women continued. They managed farms, raised families, created homes. They became leaders because they had no other choice. The Oregon Trail changed the meaning of strength. Strength was not always physical. Sometimes strength was patience. Sometimes strength was emotional control. Sometimes strength was simply waking up another morning and continuing. Samuel often said that the strongest people he knew were not always the ones carrying heavy tools. They were the ones carrying heavy memories. The mother who buried a child but continued caring for her family. The father who lost his possessions but rebuilt. The child who grew up faster because life demanded it. The trail also created moments of incredible beauty. Survival was not only suffering. Many pioneers remembered moments that amazed them. A sunrise over the plains, a valley appearing after weeks of mountains, a night sky filled with more stars than they had ever seen. The same journey that brought fear also brought wonder. One evening, after a particularly difficult week, the Carter family stopped near a quiet valley. Everyone was exhausted. Nobody wanted to speak. Then Samuel noticed something. Wildflowers were growing beside the trail. Thousands of tiny flowers surrounded the wagon path. After weeks of dust and struggle, the sight felt almost impossible. He called his mother. She looked at the flowers and smiled. "Remember this," she said. "Why?" "Because even difficult roads have beautiful places." That lesson stayed with Samuel for the rest of his life. The Oregon Trail was not only about what people suffered, it was also about what they discovered. They discovered landscapes, they discovered friendships, they discovered their own strength. By the time many pioneers reached their destinations, they were no longer the same people who had started the journey. The trail had removed comfort. It had removed certainty. It had forced them to confront fear, but it had also revealed their abilities. The pioneers carried many things west: tools, food, clothing, family treasures. But the most important thing they carried was adaptability. The ability to change when circumstances changed. The ability to continue when plans failed. The ability to rebuild. This was the true survival skill of the Oregon Trail. Not strength alone, not intelligence alone. Adaptability. Today, when people look back at the Oregon Trail, they often focus on the distance. Thousands of miles, months of travel, difficult terrain. But distance was only part of the challenge. The real challenge was everything that happened during those miles. The trail tested every part of human life: the body, the mind, the heart, the spirit. And yet, people continued. They continued because humans have always carried one powerful ability: the ability to hope. The final generations of Oregon Trail travelers eventually gave way to a new era. Railroads replaced wagon routes. The frontier changed. The world became faster. But the lessons of the trail remained. Because even today, people understand the feeling of standing before an uncertain future. The feeling of leaving something behind. The feeling of wondering whether the risk is worth taking. That is why the Oregon Trail remains alive in American memory. The wagons may be gone. The camps may be silent. The trail may be covered by time. But the human story remains. And there is still one final question. After everything pioneers endured, the hunger, the loss, the danger, and the sacrifice, what did the Oregon Trail truly leave behind? Was it only a path across America? Or was it something much greater? The Oregon Trail ended long ago. The wagon wheels stopped turning. The oxen no longer pulled heavy wooden wagons across the plains. The camps that once held hundreds of travelers disappeared. The voices of pioneers slowly faded into history. But the story of the Oregon Trail never truly ended, because the trail was never only about a road, it was about people. And people leave behind stories that survive long after they are gone. When Samuel Carter became an old man, he sometimes stood outside his home and watched the younger generations living their lives. Children played in fields, farmers worked the land, families built homes. The world around him looked completely different from the world he had known as a child. There were better roads, better tools, faster transportation. The hardships of the trail seemed like something from another age. But Samuel knew something many people forgot. The modern world had been built by people who endured difficult times. He remembered the first wagon wheel that carried his family west. It was not beautiful. It was not new. It was scratched, repaired, and worn. But to him, it represented something greater. It represented courage. It represented sacrifice. It represented a family's decision to believe in the future. The Oregon Trail became one of the most important symbols in American history because it represented a powerful idea. People can change their lives. But change often requires courage. The pioneers did not know exactly what waited ahead. They had no guarantees. They had no perfect information. They simply believed that taking the risk was better than remaining where they were. That idea became part of the American identity. The willingness to explore, the willingness to rebuild, the willingness to face uncertainty. But historians also remind us that every historical story has many sides. The Oregon Trail represented hope for many settlers. But it also represented disruption for native peoples whose lands and lives were transformed by westward expansion. The movement west changed North America forever. New towns appeared, new farms were created, trade routes expanded, the United States grew. But growth came with consequences. Indigenous communities faced loss of land, cultural disruption, and government actions that changed their futures. The history of the Oregon Trail is therefore not only a story of pioneers. It is a story of transformation, a story of many peoples, a story of a continent changing. For decades, the pioneer story was often told as a simple adventure. Families leaving home, crossing wilderness, finding success. But modern historians have worked to understand the fuller picture. They study the experiences of women, children, native nations, immigrants, workers, people whose voices were not always included in older accounts. The Oregon Trail was created by thousands of individual stories. Some were written down, many were not. A diary entry, a family letter, a name carved into a marker, a forgotten grave. Each piece reveals another part of the journey. One of the most powerful things about the Oregon Trail is that it shows the importance of ordinary people. Most pioneers were not famous. They were not generals. They were not wealthy leaders. They were everyday people. Yet their choices changed history. A farmer deciding to leave home. A mother choosing to protect her family through hardship. A traveler helping a stranger. A child learning responsibility. These small actions created something much larger. The Oregon Trail also changed the meaning of community. On the trail, people quickly learned that survival depended on cooperation. A person could not succeed completely alone. They needed others. They needed kindness. They needed trust. That lesson remains relevant today. In every generation, people face challenges that seem impossible. Different challenges, different circumstances, but the same human qualities still matter. Resilience, compassion, adaptability, hope. The pioneers did not have modern technology. They did not have instant communication. They did not have advanced medicine. They did not have many of the comforts people rely on today, but they had determination, and sometimes determination becomes the most important resource of all. Years after his journey, Samuel visited a section of the old trail. The land was quiet. No wagons, no crowds, no voices, only wind moving through the grass. He closed his eyes. For a moment he could almost hear the past, the sound of wheels, the footsteps of travelers, the voices of families preparing for another day. He thought about all the people who had walked that road, the ones who succeeded, the ones who failed, the ones whose names were remembered, the ones whose names were lost. He realized something. The trail belonged to all of them. Not every pioneer found the life they dreamed about. Some struggled after arriving. Some lost everything again. Some discovered that a new place did not automatically create a better life. But every traveler who crossed the trail became part of a remarkable human story. The Oregon Trail teaches that history is not only about victories, it is also about endurance, about continuing when success is uncertain, about trying even when failure is possible. The trail was filled with moments when people could have turned back, but many did not. They kept walking, they kept repairing, they kept believing. That may be the greatest legacy of the Oregon Trail. Not the land gained, not the towns created, not even the expansion of a nation. The greatest legacy was the example of human determination. Today, when people study the Oregon Trail, they are not simply studying wagons, they are studying human nature. They are studying what people do when faced with uncertainty. They are studying how ordinary people respond when life becomes difficult. The pioneers looked toward the west because they believed something better was possible. That belief carried them across rivers, through mountains, across deserts, through moments of fear. The road was brutal. The journey was dangerous. The cost was enormous. But their story remains because it reveals something universal. People have always searched for hope. The Oregon Trail was a road across America, but it was also a road through the human experience. A road of dreams, a road of sacrifice, a road of courage. The wagons are gone now. The trails have changed. The frontier no longer looks the same. But the question that pushed thousands of people west still exists today. How far would you go to build a better future? And perhaps that is why the Oregon Trail still fascinates people after all these years. Because every generation faces its own unknown horizon. Every generation must decide whether fear will stop them or whether hope will move them forward. The pioneers answered with action. They stepped into the unknown. They carried their families. They carried their dreams. They carried the future they hoped to create. And more than 150 years later, their journey still reminds us. The hardest roads often reveal the strongest people.